think one of the things you mentioned there is around virtual utility tokens. And I know utility tokens are spoken about a lot. That's actually a question I've also received a lot. Samuel, I don't know if you can give us any comments around why we don't specifically have utility tokens when we talk about virtual utility tokens.
To go back to your point, Petri, about utility tokens, and I thought that was an interesting comment from Melissa. And it's a comment that actually got brought up during the consultation as well. You know, why do you have virtual service tokens in the VASP law? The VASP law is the Virtual Asset Service Provider Law, just in case I use that acronym. So yeah, I understand that the digital asset sector has traditionally used a common typology around digital tokens, and that evolved. It meant classifying tokens in three main broad classes. So security tokens, utility tokens, and currency or payment tokens seem to be the top three. So, you know, security tokens, utility tokens, and currency tokens. So the existing typology, I think, gradually evolved as a result of different jurisdictions trying to classify different types of tokens and integrate them into their existing regulatory frameworks, like money services or securities, investment business, right? So how a token is classified also can impact how these jurisdictions treat revenue from those tokens for tax purposes. So they had very clear reasons as to why they would classify a token as a utility token or a securities token or a currency token. But an interesting thing is that the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is the standard setter for AML, CFT, CPF regulation around the world, so they set the standards, they took a different approach when they looked at digital assets, and they defined the term virtual asset. I don't know whether or not they were the first, but that's what they did. The FATF identified that virtual assets can be used to transmit value between two different parties. And that's what they focused on, rather than adopting the utility, security, and currency token typology. So it defined a virtual asset as a digital representation of value that can be digitally traded or transferred. And that's a broad definition that can include a large number of different tokens. Since the FATF, as I mentioned, is the standard setter for AML CFT regulatory space, it's safe to assume that most countries are gradually going to adopt this broad definition from them, or one very similar to it. I think this can already be seen around the world with an increasing number of countries adopting the term virtual asset or a term with a similar definition in their local legislation. So when we were crafting the regulatory framework for virtual asset services, we had two options. We could adopt the existing typology of security, utility, currency tokens, and then try to adapt them to the FATF standards, or we could adopt the FATF's definition of virtual asset service. Our main goal was to make sure that our framework complies with the emerging global standards. So when the Virtual Asset Service Provider Law was drafted, it was drafted to differentiate essentially between a virtual asset and what is not a virtual asset. In the Virtual Asset Service Provider Law, we called that a service token or a virtual service token. So I think that term might have confused, you know, some individuals when they first encountered it. But that's the main reason behind it, is we're just identifying, we're making a distinction between a virtual asset and what is not a virtual asset. So virtual service tokens are tokens that are digital representations of value, but they can't be traded or transferred. So that can be credit card reward points. It can be credit towards a service, which is why they're called virtual service tokens, or even certain types of non-transferable digital tokens. The FATF found it important to ensure that these digital assets were not included in its recommendations, and we agreed with that approach. So that's, in a nutshell, why you don't see virtual utility token or utility token in the regulatory framework as we have it now. It's because we opted to adopt the FATF's approach instead of the existing typology that existed before the FATF came out with its updated guidance.